First, the world is running out of gold, and history says what happens next is never peaceful. You might believe that your money is safe or that the financial systems governing your life are stable, but this is the single most dangerous illusion designed to keep you complacent while the foundation rots. By the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand why the vanishing of physical collateral is the only signal that matters, and why we are seeing it happen again right now. To understand the future, we must first investigate the original crime scene. It starts not on Wall Street, but in the marble halls of the Roman Empire, specifically around the 1st century AD. You see, Rome was the superpower of its day, invincible and wealthy, yet it was suffering from a fatal, invisible wound. It was hemorrhaging money. We know this because we have the records from the world's first financial whistleblower, Pliny the Elder. Writing around 77 AD, Pliny looked at the empire's books and panicked. He calculated that Rome was running a massive trade deficit with the East, specifically India and China. The Romans were obsessed with luxury: Chinese silk, Indian pepper, Arabian pearls, commodities that vanish or degrade. But the East? They didn't want Roman wine or olive oil. They wanted hard assets. They demanded payment in solid gold and silver. Pliny estimated that the empire was draining 100 million sesterces every single year to the East. That is roughly 1 million gold auri, leaving European circulation annually, never to return. He famously wrote, "So dearly do we pay for our luxury and our women." Now, pause and really visualize that number. 100 million sesterces. This wasn't just spending. This was a physical removal of the money supply. Rome was literally emptying its vaults to pay for spices that would be eaten and silk that would rot. The gold went to India, and the silver went to China, creating a massive liquidity vacuum in the West. The emperor was the wealthiest man in the world on paper, but physically, the treasury was running on fumes. This was the first global gold shortage, and just like today, the government couldn't admit they were broke. So they did what desperate empires always do when the real money runs out. They decided to fake it. It began in 64 AD, a date you need to mark as the beginning of the end. Emperor Nero, facing a budget crisis and a shrinking supply of bullion, made a decision that modern central bankers would find hauntingly familiar. He ordered the mints to cheat. He reduced the silver purity of the denarius to just 90%. It was a subtle theft, barely noticeable to the common shopkeeper, but it broke a sacred trust. Once the seal was broken, the floodgates opened. What followed was a slow-motion train wreck of monetary destruction. By 170 AD, under Marcus Aurelius, a man often praised as a philosopher king, the silver purity had plummeted to 75%. You have to ask yourself, why? Because the real wealth was still flowing east to pay for that deficit we talked about, while the costs of running the empire, the wars, the legions, the bureaucracy, kept rising. The government couldn't print gold, so they printed lies. Fast forward to 270 AD, the crisis of the 3rd century. By this point, the currency wasn't just damaged, it was a fraud. Under Emperor Aurelian, the standard coin, the Antoninianus, contained merely 5% silver. It was essentially a slug of bronze dipped in a thin chemical wash of silver to make it look shiny for a few weeks. If you rubbed it too hard between your fingers, the silver would flake off, revealing the worthless base metal underneath. This is where the bad ending kicks in. The economy didn't just slow down, it shattered. We saw hyperinflation on a scale that makes modern price hikes look like a rounding error. The price of wheat skyrocketed, not because wheat was scarce, but because the money was trash. The trust evaporated so completely that the Roman legions, the very muscle holding the civilization together, began refusing payment in coins. They demanded payment in kind. They wanted salt, leather, and clothing. Think about the implications of that. The most powerful military machine on earth refused to accept the government's money. When the soldiers stopped believing in the currency, the state effectively ceases to exist. The gold had drained away, the substitutes had failed, and the West was plunged into darkness. But as Rome fell, the cycle didn't stop. It just went dormant, waiting for the next victim. History is a wheel that grinds the unprepared, and by the mid-15th century, that wheel had turned a full circle. We leave the ruins of Rome and fast forward to the 1450s. Europe had rebuilt itself, trade was flourishing, and the Renaissance was on the horizon. But beneath the surface, the exact same cancer that killed the Roman economy was eating away at medieval Europe. This event is known by historians as the Great Bullion Famine, and it is perhaps the most terrifying financial crisis you have never heard of. It peaked between 1457 and 1464, and the mechanics were brutally simple. Just like the Romans before them, Europeans were addicted to Eastern goods, spices from the Mamluks, silk from the Ottomans, and just like the Romans, they had nothing the East wanted. The city-state of Venice became the great funnel for this wealth transfer. Records indicate that Venice was exporting roughly 300,000 gold ducats worth of bullion every single year to the East. That is an astronomical sum for the time. Think of Europe as a bathtub, and Venice as the open drain. The water level, the gold and silver that allowed people to buy bread, pay rent, or hire workers, was dropping rapidly. But this time, there was a twist that made the situation critical. While the money was flowing out, the supply at the source cut off. The great silver mines of Europe, located in Saxony and Bohemia, simultaneously hit bedrock. They ran dry. We talk about liquidity crises today in abstract terms, usually involving digital numbers on a screen. But in the 1450s, this was physical. The actual coins required to conduct commerce simply ceased to exist. Imagine walking into a market to buy food. You have the desire to buy, the merchant has the desire to sell, but the transaction cannot happen because the medium of exchange, the silver penny, has physically vanished from the town. It was a monetary stroke. The blood supply of the economy had clotted. Europe was technically wealthy in land and labor, but it was completely insolvent in cash. And as the vaults echoed with emptiness, the symptoms of the crash began to manifest in the most vital organs of the state, the mints themselves. As the drain intensified, the silence began to spread across the continent. You can measure the severity of a financial crash, not by the shouting on the trading floor, but by the silence of the machinery that is supposed to sustain it. By the late 1450s, that silence was deafening. In 1456, the mints in Saxony, once the beating heart of European silver production, shut their doors completely. There was simply no metal left to strike. But the most chilling data comes from England. We have the mint records from this period, and they tell a story of absolute paralysis. In the year 1460, the Tower of London, the fortress of English currency, struck exactly 0 gold coins. Not a limited run, not a reduced output. 0. For nearly an entire year, the production of high-value currency in England flatlined. Think about what that means for a moment. The crown, desperate for revenue, could not produce the very symbol of its power because the raw materials had been sucked away to the east. It wasn't just England. Across the Channel in France, the profession of money changer effectively went extinct. These were the bankers of their day, sitting at tables in the town squares, exchanging foreign coins for local ones. But you cannot change money when there is no money to change. They packed up their tables and vanished, leaving the marketplaces empty. The economy didn't just recede, it froze. Without coin, you couldn't pay soldiers. You couldn't collect taxes. You couldn't trade beyond your immediate village. It was a forced regression to a dark age of barter, a humiliation for a continent that prided itself on sophistication. The bullion famine had stripped the gears of civilization. And here's the psychological truth you need to internalize. When a society is backed into a corner like this, starved of wealth, desperate for liquidity, and facing economic extinction, it becomes incredibly dangerous. It stops looking for internal solutions and starts looking for external victims. The shortage had created a pressure cooker that could not be contained within Europe's borders. The silence of the mints was the calm before a very violent storm, because the powers of Europe realized they had only one option left. If they couldn't dig the gold out of their own ground, they would have to go take it from someone else. This leads us to the most significant pivot point in human history, and it forces us to re-examine everything we think we know about the Age of Discovery. You were likely told a fairy tale in school. You were told that brave men like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama set sail because of a noble spirit of curiosity, a thirst for knowledge, or a desire to map the unknown world. That is a comfortable lie. The reality is much colder and much more transactional. The explorations of the late 15th century were not scientific missions. They were desperate, frantic bailouts. They were the direct result of the great bullion famine backing Europe against a wall. The continent was physically starving for capital, and the leaders knew that if they didn't find new metal, their kingdoms would collapse into irrelevance. When the Portuguese pushed south down the coast of Africa, they weren't looking for new friends. They were hunting for the source of the Mali gold trade to bypass the Muslim middlemen. They named the region the Gold Coast, not out of poetic flair, but out of literal aching necessity. And then there is Columbus. When he pitched his voyage to the Spanish monarchs, the selling point wasn't geography or science, it was solvency. Europe needed a liquidity injection to survive. If you analyze the diaries of Columbus from his first voyage, the word gold appears with obsessive frequency. He wasn't just an explorer, he was a prospector on a state-sponsored mission to restart the stopped heart of the European economy. This solution to the shortage changed the world forever, but it was born from panic. It triggered the brutal conquest of the Americas, which was, in financial terms, a hostile takeover. The Inca and Aztec empires were not just conquered for territory, they were liquidated. The massive influx of bullion that eventually flooded back into Spain, and then the rest of Europe, didn't just make kings rich. It ended the famine. It reflated the global economy. The shortage was fixed, but the cost was paid in the destruction of entire civilizations. The cycle of drain and shortage had been broken, but only by inflicting a nightmare scenario on a new hemisphere. However, as the centuries turned and the world industrialized, the nature of the shortage changed. It stopped being about nature running out of gold and started being about men hiding it. By the time we reached the 20th century, the game had evolved. The shortage wasn't about finding gold anymore, it was about keeping it. The cycle we are tracking shifts here from a geological problem to a psychological one, and in many ways, that makes it far more volatile. We land now in the gray, desperate days following the crash of 1929. The world had built a sophisticated financial cathedral called the gold standard, believing it was unshakable. But fear is a frequency that can shatter glass, and in the 1930s, the frequency was deafening. What happened next is what economists call a scramble for liquidity. But let's call it what it really was, a global panic attack. After the stock market disintegrated, the average citizen looked at the paper money in their wallet and the numbers in their bank book, and they felt a cold pit in their stomach. They realized that those paper notes were merely claims on wealth, not wealth itself. And when you stop trusting the promise, you demand the collateral. Across Europe and America, a massive silent drain began. It wasn't foreign empires sucking the gold away this time, it was the people. Ordinary citizens, terrified of bank failures, began withdrawing gold coins and bullion from the system and hiding them. They buried jars in backyards, stuffed coins into mattresses, and locked bars in private safety deposit boxes. The gold wasn't leaving the country, it was going underground. It was exiting the financial system and entering the private economy. This created an artificial shortage of terrifying proportions for the central banks. The vaults that underpinned the entire global credit system were bleeding out, not because the mines were empty, but because the public was opting out of the game. The data from this period is staggering. In the early 1930s, the velocity of money collapsed, but the demand for physical metal skyrocketed. The system was designed to operate on a fractional reserve, assuming only a few people would want their gold at any one time. But when everyone wants their gold at the same time, the illusion breaks. The central bankers watched their reserves dwindle day by day, realizing with horror that the mob was calling their bluff. The shortage was man-made, driven by a collective loss of faith, and it pushed the world's most powerful financial institution to the breaking point. The dam was about to burst, and the first crack would appear in the very center of the financial universe, London. If you want to pinpoint the moment the old world died, look at September 1931. The Bank of England wasn't just a bank, it was the sun around which the entire financial solar system orbited. For a century, the phrase, safe as the Bank of England, meant something absolute. It meant that a British pound was as good as a specific weight of gold anywhere on Earth at any time. That promise was the bedrock of global trade. But in the late summer of 1931, the bedrock cracked. The shortage we discussed, driven by hoarding and panic, suddenly focused its laser intensity on London. Foreign central banks and nervous investors began to doubt Britain's ability to hold the line. They stopped rolling over their loans and started demanding the metal. The numbers are chilling in their speed. In just a few weeks in July and August, the Bank of England hemorrhaged over $30 million in gold. In today's valuation, that is billions of dollars vanishing from the vault in a heartbeat. The directors of the bank watched helplessly as the gold carts rolled out the doors day after day, heading for ships bound for France and the United States. They raised interest rates to try and bribe people to keep their money in sterling, but panic is immune to logic. The drain accelerated. On September 19th, 1931, the situation became terminal. The reserves were critically low. The British government had to face the humiliating reality. They had run out of gold. 2 days later, they suspended the gold standard. This was a seismic shock. It was effectively a national default. The pound, stripped of its gold backing, instantly lost value. But the contagion was the real story. When the leader falls, the pack scatters. Within weeks, 25 other nations were forced to follow suit, severing the link between their currencies and gold. The global monetary system fractured into competitive devaluation and trade wars. The shortage had claimed its biggest victim yet. The polite fiction of international finance had been shattered. But across the Atlantic, the United States was watching. They saw what happened to Britain, and they decided they wouldn't let the market drain their vaults. Instead of bowing to the shortage, the American government decided to attack it. If the people were hoarding the gold, then the government would declare war on the people. This brings us to the most aggressive authoritarian response to a gold shortage in modern history. It proves that when a government is cornered by a lack of real money, there are no rules they won't break. The date was April 5th, 1933. The United States was deep in the Depression, and the banking system was teetering. President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced the same drain that had broken the Bank of England. Citizens were pulling gold out of the system, hiding it, protecting their wealth from the crumbling economy. FDR's solution wasn't to restore confidence, it was to criminalize caution. He signed Executive Order 6102. Read that again. An executive order. Not a law debated in Congress, but a command from the top. This order made it illegal for any individual, partnership, association, or corporation to possess monetary gold. The government effectively nationalized the very concept of wealth. They gave the American people an ultimatum. turn in your gold to the Federal Reserve or face the consequences. And the consequences were not a slap on the wrist. Violators faced a $10,000 fine, which is equivalent to roughly $230,000 today, or 10 years in federal prison. Think about the psychological weight of that. You could be thrown in a cage for a decade simply for trying to preserve your savings in the only asset that had held value for 5,000 years. The government forced citizens to sell their gold to the state at the official price of $20.67 per ounce. Millions of Americans, terrified of being branded criminals, lined up to hand over their coins, their bullion, their legacy. The vaults of the Federal Reserve swelled with the confiscated wealth of the nation. But here is the sting in the tale, the heist that history books often glaze over. Once the gold was safely in government hands and out of yours, FDR devalued the dollar. In 1934, he raised the official price of gold to 35 $35 per ounce. Do the math. The government took your gold at roughly $20, then immediately declared it was worth $35. In the blink of an eye, they had robbed the American saver of nearly 70% of their purchasing power. They recapitalized the government by stealing the equity of the people. The shortage was solved by confiscation and devaluation. It was a ruthless maneuver, proving that in the cycle of gold shortages, the individual is always the collateral damage. And now, as we look at the data today, the wheel is turning again. We arrive now at the present moment, standing on the edge of the precipice. You might look around and see a world that appears stable, with stock markets flashing green and currencies trading normally. But if you have followed this narrative, you now possess a lens that 99% of the population lacks. You know that the signal of a collapse isn't noise, it is the silent movement of physical metal. And right now, the metal is moving faster than it has in over half a century. The official narrative from modern economists and financial media is that gold is a barbarous relic. They tell you it is an antiquated asset, a pet rock, something that belongs in a museum, not a portfolio. They urge you to trust in digital currencies, sovereign debt, and the perpetual promise of fiat money. But watch what they do, not what they say. In the last few years, global central banks have been buying gold at a pace not seen since 1967, just before the collapse of the London gold pool and the end of the Bretton Woods era. The data is unequivocal. Nations like China, Poland, Singapore, and Turkey are aggressively converting their paper reserves into hard bullion. They are draining the global supply. Why? Because they recognize the symptoms we just analyzed. They see the Roman-style debasement in the endless printing of new currency. They see the 1450s-style stagnation, where real growth has stalled. They fear the 1930s-style counterparty risk, where the assets you think you own can be frozen or seized by a foreign power. The global gold shortage of our time is currently invisible to the consumer because it is happening at the wholesale level. The giants are front-running the exit. They are securing their lifeboats while telling the passengers on the Titanic that the ship is unsinkable. When the shortage finally trickles down to the retail level, when you try to buy a coin and find that premiums have exploded or the shelves are empty, it will be too late. The cycle has already turned. History is screaming at us. From the empty vaults of Rome to the silent mints of London, the lesson is absolute. When the physical collateral vanishes, the society built upon it fractures. The shortage always ends badly for those holding the paper promises. The only question remaining isn't if the cycle will conclude, but when, and whether you will be standing on the side of the desperate or the prepared.